Hello, and welcome to this webinar on version 2.0 of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse Handbook of Standards and Procedures. Thank you for joining us. We have three presenters today. I'm Sandra Wilson, the Project Director for the Clearinghouse. I'm joined today by Scott Brown, our Director of Evidence Reviews, and Sue Kearns, our Principal Investigator. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information about how we made changes to the Prevention Services Clearinghouse's Handbook of Standards and Procedures, provide some details about the specific changes that were made, and describe how to request a review or re-review under Handbook version 2.0. The new handbook is publicly available at the link shown on the slide, which is preventionservices.acf.hhs.gov/resources/Handbook of Standards and Procedures 2. By way of background, the Prevention Services Clearinghouse was developed to be an objective and transparent source of information on the evidence-based programs and services that may be eligible for funding under Title IV-E of the Social Security Act, as amended by the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018. The Clearinghouse uses a systematic review process implemented by trained reviewers using consistent, transparent standards and procedures. The Handbook of Standards and Procedures describes the standards the Clearinghouse uses to identify and review programs and services, and the procedures that are followed by Clearinghouse staff. The first Handbook of Standards and Procedures, version 1.0, was released in June 2019. That handbook has been the basis for all reviews thus far. Creating version 2.0 was a multi-year process, and version 2.0 was published on July 1st. The Handbook of Standards and Procedures, version 2.0, aims to enhance transparency, be responsive to feedback from experts and members of the public, support the needs of underserved communities and families, align with current best practices for systematic evidence reviews, and maintain alignment with the requirements of the authorizing legislation for the Prevention Services Clearinghouse, which is the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018, as codified in Title IV-E of the Social Security Act. The website for the Title IV-E Prevention Services Clearinghouse can be found at preventionservices.acf.hhs.gov. This is a screenshot of the homepage of the website. The arrow points to the Resources tab, which is where you can find the link to the Handbook of Standards and Procedures version 2.0. You can also access version 1.0 for reference. The revisions were informed by lessons learned from the implementation of standards and operational procedures. We also received feedback through expert consultations, recommendations, and questions sent to the inbox from program and service developers, study authors, and other members of the public. Experts who advised the Prevention Services Clearinghouse included individuals with lived expertise, individuals from communities that programs and services are intended to serve, inclusive of underserved and tribal communities, methodological experts, state, tribal, and local child welfare department staff or administrators, policymakers, program or service developers, program or service providers or trainers, study authors, and subject matter experts in the fields of mental health, substance use and misuse, parenting and parent skill-based programs and services, kinship navigator programs, child welfare, implementation science, and cultural responsiveness and equity. We also reviewed best practices and standards used in the literature and by other clearinghouses. In addition, we solicited feedback directly from the public during the public comment period on the Handbook version 1.0 standards. These activities informed initial draft standards that we presented to experts for feedback. In total, we consulted with over 40 experts in the process of revising the handbook. From this process, the Clearinghouse team created the draft handbook version 2.0, which was then released via a Federal Register notice for public comment. The final handbook version 2.0 considered the public comments as well as expert feedback. The Prevention Services Clearinghouse plans to host periodic engagement activities for the public, including at least one focused on Handbook version 2.0. We will be announcing these activities through the listserv and in the What's New section on the website homepage. As a reminder, you can sign up for the listserv directly from the website. In order to transition to the new handbook, the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is working to train reviewers to consistently and systematically implement the revised standards and procedures. The Clearinghouse plans to begin reviewing programs and services using the new Handbook of Standards and Procedures in the coming months. In an effort to continue to review and rate programs and services as quickly as possible, reviews under the Handbook of Standards and Procedures version 1.0 will be ongoing during the transition period. The public will be clearly notified on the Prevention Services Clearinghouse website and via the Prevention Services Clearinghouse email list when the final published Handbook version 2.0 will go into effect for reviewing programs and services. How to request a program or service re-review. Procedures for re-review of programs and services are described in section 8.5 of the handbook. If requesting a re-review, provide any information about why you believe a re-review may result in a change to the program or service rating. If possible, please include relevant information about the program or service, including any known studies. Re-reviews can be requested by any member of the public by emailing the Clearinghouse. This includes programs and services reviewed under Handbook version 1.0. Please note that the Prevention Services Clearinghouse email address has changed to preventionservices@aptglobal.com. Email sent to the previous email address will still come to our inbox, however. We'll now highlight the revisions to the handbook. A detailed summary of revisions to the Handbook of Standards and Procedures is included in the appendix of version 2.0 of the handbook. This slide shows a screenshot of the first page of that appendix. Introduction to version 2.0. In the introduction to the revised handbook, an updated review process graphic explicitly describes how the Clearinghouse integrates active engagement throughout the review process, including describing the many types of experts consulted, including those with lived expertise. This slide shows a screenshot of the new graphic, which is available in the Handbook version 2.0. The introduction also describes 3 planned pilot activities to inform future revisions to the handbook. These pilot activities include examining the feasibility of reviewing studies that are published only in Spanish, developing standards and procedures to review studies that use single case designs that may contribute to promising ratings, and understanding the feasibility and considerations for the systematic review of subgroup analyses and how they may contribute to program or service ratings. In addition, the introduction now describes the factors that influence the review timeline. It remains the goal of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse to conduct reviews of programs and services as quickly as possible. I will now turn the presentation over to Sue Kearns to continue describing the revisions to the handbook.
All right, Chapter 1 is Identify Programs and Services. In Chapter 1, Identify Programs and Services, revisions clarify that all program and service recommendations are retained for consideration, including those submitted during public calls and ad hoc recommendations submitted to the Prevention Services Clearinghouse inbox. Revisions in Chapter 1 also clarify that any member of the public may submit a program or service recommendation at any time to the Clearinghouse via email, and that suggested information to include as part of a program or service recommendation can be found on the FAQ section of the Clearinghouse website. Additionally, Chapter 1 now indicates that all programs and services recommended as potential candidates for review are posted on the Clearinghouse website. Chapter 2 is Prioritize and Select Programs and Services. In Chapter 2, Prioritize Programs and Services, there were multiple revisions. Program and service area definitions in Section 2.1 have been revised to be more inclusive of a broader range of programs and services that may be eligible for review. Based on Federal Register notice feedback and consultation with experts in the fields of mental health, substance use, parenting, and parent skill-based programs and services, kinship navigator programs, and child welfare, Handbook version 2.0 includes revised and clarified program or service area definitions for in-home parent skill-based programs and services and substance use prevention and treatment programs and services. For in-home parent skill-based programs and services, the revised definition is more flexible and now indicates that eligible programs and services must involve direct intervention with a parent or caregiver and target parenting skills or other skills that can be applied to where the child resides, including in the home. The revised definition also clarifies the delivery of programs and services can occur in the home or other settings and defines necessary content for a program or service to be considered skill-based. For substance use prevention and treatment programs and services, the revised definition clarifies the programs and services targeting recovery from substance use, as well as those targeting prevention, reduction, treatment, remediation, and or elimination of substance use or misuse are eligible, and programs and services without client-oriented substance use prevention or treatment components, such as mass communications or media campaigns, or interventions that solely target broader community level or policy systems, remain not eligible. The Handbook of Standards and Procedures version 2.0 also now clarifies that a wide range of programs and services may be eligible for review if they meet the definition for an eligible program or service area. This includes, but is not limited to, economic and other concrete support programs and services, domestic violence or DV programs and services, parent partner programs and services, peer partner programs and services, parent education peer support groups, and other programs and services that focus on contextual and systemic risk factors. For revisions and clarifications to program or service prioritization criteria, Section 2.2, there remains a high volume of potentially eligible programs and services identified for review. As a result, the Prevention Services Clearinghouse must continue to prioritize programs and services for review. The Handbook version 2.0 continues to prioritize programs and services with available evidence of eligibility and programs and services in active use, Section 2.2. Additional program or service prioritization criteria, also in Section 2.2, were informed by recommendations from public comments and consultation with experts. These include the number and source of program or service recommendations received, child welfare relevance, population served, previous evaluations and studies, and implementation supports. The Clearinghouse continues to prioritize programs and services in a way that ensures representation across the 4 program and service areas. The handbook also presents revised program or service adaptations criteria in section 2.3.2. Multiple public comments requested clarification regarding the program or service adaptation standards specified in Handbook version 1.0 and recommended increased inclusivity. The Prevention Services Clearinghouse sought input from a range of experts specifically focusing on program or service adaptations, including those with expertise in adaptations designed to serve historically underserved communities. Section 2.3.2 clarifies the standard process by which the Prevention Services Clearinghouse assesses program or service adaptations. A revised table in Exhibit 2.4 now classifies key program or service elements and gives examples of adaptations that are substantial and not substantial, including expanded examples. Manuals that are substantially adapted from a focal manual may be considered as a separate program or service when reviewing studies. Manuals without substantial adaptations may be considered the same program or service when reviewing studies. Chapter 3 is the literature search. In Chapter 3, which describes the literature search for each review of a program or service, the handbook includes additional clearinghouses that are part of the search strategy. The list of bibliographic databases used in the search has been trimmed for efficiency based on a determination that some databases in Handbook version 1.0 largely provided duplicative information. This section also clarifies that any publicly available research from a program or service website is incorporated into the literature search. Chapter 4 is Study Eligibility, Screening, and Prioritization. Chapter 4, Study Eligibility, Screening, and Prioritization indicates that there are also revisions to Study Eligibility, Screening, and Prioritization in Handbook version 2.0. Some public comments indicated confusion about whether studies conducted outside of the United States or those conducted in non-English speaking countries are eligible. Handbook version 2.0 clarifies that the standard from Handbook version 1.0 that studies must be available in English in section 4.1.3 includes studies originally published in another language that have published English language translations available. This section also indicates that the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is planning to conduct a pilot to understand the feasibility of reviewing studies available only in Spanish. Handbook version 2.0 explicitly clarifies that studies conducted in any country are eligible in section 4.1.4, as they were under Handbook version 1.0. For revisions to eligible comparison conditions, section 4.1.7, many public comments requested expansion of eligible study comparison conditions beyond no or minimal treatment and treatment as usual to include more active comparison conditions. Many experts also recommended that the Prevention Services Clearinghouse consider including active comparison conditions. Handbook version 2.0 now includes two new types of eligible comparison conditions: placebo or attention control conditions and head-to-head comparisons. So there are now 5 types of eligible comparison conditions, including 1, no intervention, untreated groups or waitlist conditions; 2, minimal intervention conditions; 3, placebo or attention control conditions; 4, treatment as usual conditions; and 5, head-to-head comparisons. The first 2, no intervention and minimal intervention comparison conditions, were also eligible in Handbook version 1.0. For the no intervention, untreated, or waitlist conditions, comparison participants are offered no services or services at a later date, clarifying that outcomes measured after a waitlist group is offered the intervention are not eligible. The minimal intervention conditions are those providing informational materials or psychoeducation, referrals to available services, or similar nominal services. One new type of eligible comparison conditions includes placebo or attention control conditions. These are conditions designed to account for non-active effects of treatment, such as participants' expectations, contact time with an interventionist, or the relationship between the interventionist and participants are eligible. This includes psychological or pharmacological placebos, attention placebos, and nonspecific therapy, in which participants receive the same or similar amount of attention or contact as the participants in the intervention condition. As in Handbook version 1.0, treatment as usual comparison conditions remain eligible. Handbook version 2.0 clarifies that both usual or typical services, in which individuals do not receive anything they would not have been able to receive outside of the context of the study, and services consistent with usual or typical services, such as services provided as part of the study that are not offered in the community, but are clearly described as consistent with the usual or typical services that would be received by individuals or families similar to those in the study, are considered eligible under treatment as usual. Pharmacological interventions that meet the definition of treatment as usual are eligible. Finally, head-to-head comparisons are also now eligible comparison conditions in Handbook version 2.0. Specifically, head-to-head comparisons in which comparison group participants are assigned to another intervention that is not a variant of the program or service under review are eligible. These conditions may also be referred to as alternative interventions, active interventions, or comparator interventions. Excluded are comparisons to pharmacological interventions that do not meet the definition of treatment as usual.
Chapter 5, Evidence Review for RCTs and QEDs using the Design and Execution Standards. Revisions to Chapter 5, Design and Execution Standards. Public comments expressed a desire for greater flexibility regarding options for demonstrating baseline equivalence and reconsideration of participants' socio-demographic characteristics that could be used to establish baseline equivalence when a pretest alternative is not available. Informed by expert consultations, Chapter 5 of the Handbook version 2.0 maintains a general preference for using the same or nearly the same measure as the outcome, that is, a direct pretest, for baseline equivalence, but now allows any eligible outcome measure demonstrated to be correlated with the outcome at a threshold of 0.60 or higher to be used to establish baseline equivalence. This is referred to as a correlated pretest measure. Chapter 6, Record and Characterize Impact Estimates. Handbook version 2.0 now includes a separate chapter that outlines the procedures used to record and characterize impact estimates to inform program and service ratings, including procedures for testing the statistical significance of impact estimates and computing effect sizes. Clarification is provided on information needed and procedures used to assess statistical significance and compute effect sizes from repeated measure models, and indicates that point-in-time estimates for each measurement time period are required. Chapter 7, Program or Service Ratings. For the revisions to Chapter 7, Program or Service Ratings, no changes were made to the criteria for promising, supported, or well-supported program or service ratings in Handbook version 2.0, Section 7.1. Chapter 7 clarifies that the intention of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is for program or service ratings from reviews conducted under Handbook version 1.0 to be retained until such time that a program or service is re-reviewed under Handbook version 2.0. See Section 8.5.1 regarding re-review procedures. Handbook version 2.0 also provides clarification on how the Prevention Services Clearinghouse defines usual care or practice settings, and how the Prevention Services Clearinghouse assesses the duration of sustained effects. In addition, the revisions to Chapter 7, Program or Service Ratings, also include a new standard specified in the Risk of Harm section, Section 7.2.1 of Handbook version 2.0. The new standard is that contrasts in head-to-head comparison conditions or placebo or attention control comparison conditions where the comparison condition has any evidence for risk of harm cannot contribute to a promising, supported, or well-supported rating. If risk of harm is present in these kinds of comparison conditions, impact estimates are not clearly interpretable as evidence of program or service effectiveness, because it is possible that both the intervention and comparison condition could be made worse off than if they had not participated in the program or service at all. Chapter 8, Prevention Services Clearinghouse Procedures. In Chapter 8, Prevention Services Clearinghouse Procedures, operational procedures for conducting the evidence review have been clarified in Handbook version 2.0. Additional details provided on author query policies and timelines and program and service developer query policies and timelines, and new sections on external communications and active engagement have been added. Additional revisions to the procedures described in Chapter 8 include the following. When the Prevention Services Clearinghouse completes the transition to Handbook version 2.0, the intention of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is to conduct reviews of any program or service not previously reviewed under Handbook version 1.0 solely under the standards and procedures specified in Handbook version 2.0 after the transition period. Programs or services that are included on the working list of programs and services planned for review prior to when Handbook version 2.0 is finalized may be reviewed under Handbook version 1.0 or Handbook version 2.0. The version of the handbook used to conduct a review or re-review of a program or service will be clearly stated on the working list and on the program or services review page on the Clearinghouse website. The Prevention Services Clearinghouse intends to conduct program and service re-reviews solely under Handbook version 2.0 after the transition period, section 8.5.1. The intention of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is that all existing program and service ratings determined under Handbook version 1.0 will remain in effect until such time that a program or service re-review is conducted. Program and services reviewed by the Prevention Services Clearinghouse under Handbook version 1.0 may be considered for re-review under Handbook version 2.0 if a re-review has the potential to change the program or service rating, section 8.5.1. Program or service ratings could potentially change due to application of Handbook version 2.0 standards to studies already identified in a prior review. For example, studies that were previously ineligible may be eligible under Handbook version 2.0, or studies may be able to demonstrate baseline equivalence under revised standards, or the emergence of new evidence since the original review. The intention of the Clearinghouse is that the rating of a re-reviewed program or service will be based solely on the standards and procedures in Handbook version 2.0. That is, the previously assigned rating would no longer be in effect. In addition, revisions to Chapter 8 procedures clarify that the intention of the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is to conduct study re-reviews or those due to missing information or errors in the currently published review of an individual study under the version of the handbook used to review the program or service, section 8.5.2. That is, for a program or service reviewed under Handbook version 1.0, where the program or service has not been re-reviewed under Handbook version 2.0, a study re-review would be conducted under Handbook version 1.0. For a program or service where a program or service rating has been assigned using Handbook version 2.0, study re-reviews would be conducted using Handbook version 2.0. The Clearinghouse's intention is that the emergence of substantial new evidence that has the potential to change program or service ratings, such as a newly published study, should be addressed through a program or service re-review. Similarly, cases where applications of Handbook version 2.0 standards to a study reviewed under Handbook version 1.0 could affect the program or service rating are intended to be addressed through a program or service re-review. Study re-reviews are intended to be limited solely to addressing missing information or errors in studies already reviewed. Finally, should a new manual edition as defined in section 2.3.2 be published, the public may request consideration of an update to the manual citation used for the program or service. Procedures for manual updates are described in section 8.5.3. Implementation of Handbook version 2.0. The public will be clearly notified on the Prevention Services Clearinghouse website and via other avenues, such as email to subscribers to the Prevention Services Clearinghouse email list, when the final published Handbook version 2.0 will go into effect for reviewing programs and services. Please note that the Prevention Services Clearinghouse email address has changed to preventionservices@aptglobal.com. Though emails sent to the previous email address will still come into our inbox. Procedures for re-review of programs and services, studies, and for updating manual citations are described in section 8.5 of the handbook. If requesting a re-review, Provide any information about why you believe a re-review may result in a change to the program or service rating, such as that there are new studies or analyses available, you have identified an error in the review, or the program or service was reviewed under Handbook version 1.0, but Handbook version 2.0 could allow for additional consideration. If possible, include relevant information about the program or service, including any known studies. We conclude by noting that the Prevention Services Clearinghouse periodically provides clarification on topics covered in the Handbook of Standards and Procedures. To learn more, please visit the FAQ page on the Prevention Services Clearinghouse website. We appreciate your interest in the revised handbook. Please do not hesitate to reach out via email. This concludes our webinar.